In the 1880 federal census for the town of Bridgton, Maine, which is in the western half of the state of Maine, there's a list of 16 people living at a place called the town farm. Now, most of them were elderly. Most of them were alone. Most of them are there because the world ran out of options for them. And then there's this Edwin Littlefield, age 13, mother deceased, father unknown, attending school. I looked for Edwin Littlefield for a long time. After 1880, he disappears from the Bridgeton records entirely. I never found him, but I'll come back to that. Before we talk about Bridgeton, we need to talk about what a town farm actually was, because it's easy to look at that phrase, town farm, and think it sounds almost pleasant. A farm that belongs to the town, fresh air, hard work, community. The reality is a little more complicated. New England had, since the colonial period, a system of local responsibility for the poor, and this was based on Elizabethan poor laws. And the idea was simple. Every person belonged to a town, and their town was responsible for them. If you were sick or disabled or old or widowed or just unlucky, you didn't go to the state, you went to the town. Now, towns managed this in a few ways. The first was warning out, literally warning non-residents to leave before they could establish legal claim on the town's charity. The second was bidding out, auctioning the care of a poor person to the lowest bidder. Some farmer would agree to feed and house a pauper in exchange for their labor and a small payment from the town. And then there was the town farm, the almshouse, the poorhouse. By whatever name you call it, it was the institution of last resort. The theory was that a town farm would be self-supporting. The inmates, and yes, that was the official word used the same way it's used for any institution, not an insult, would work on the farm. They'd grow their own food, raise their own livestock, produce surplus to sell. The town's cost would be minimal, in theory. That theory rarely matched the practice. Town farms were chronically underfunded, they were difficult to staff, and they were increasingly expensive to maintain. The people who ended up there were not, generally speaking, able-bodied farmers. They were old or disabled or sick or some combination of all three. The Spartan conditions were partly by design. A town farm that was too comfortable might encourage people to choose it over self-sufficiency. So the beds were hard, the food was plain, and nobody came unless they had absolutely no other choice. This was specifically and distinctly a New England system. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, they brought with them the English Poor Laws of 1601, the idea that the community was responsible for its poor, and that responsibility lived at the local level. Every person belonged to a town, and towns defended that obligation fiercely. If you appeared in a town and seemed likely to become a burden, selectmen could warn you out, literally have the constable escort you back to wherever you came from. Before town farms existed, many towns handled their poor through a system called bidding out, auctioning the care of a dependent person to whoever offered the lowest price. Some farmer would take in an elderly widow or a disabled man in exchange for a small payment from the town. The town saved money. What the dependent person experienced depended entirely on who bid the lowest. In Corinth, Vermont, local historian Larry Coffin preserves the story of the Taplin children, children of Jonas Taplin, whose deaths became a warning about the cruelty possible under the bidding out system. According to Coffin's account, the children were placed with a low bidder, kept in a shed through the winter, and died of neglect. Now, whether or not one case alone ended the practice, stories like this helped expose the danger built into the system. Towns were paying for the cheapest care, and the cheapest care could become no care at all. The town farm was the reform. It was considered the more humane alternative. In Vermont alone, there were nearly 100 of them by the 1880s. New Hampshire organized it differently, by county rather than by town, with 10 county poorhouses serving the whole state. Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, every New England state had its own version of the same system. A woman from Hamden, Maine, named Dorothea Dix, changed all of that, or tried to. In 1841, Dix volunteered to teach Sunday school at the East Cambridge, Massachusetts jail and found mentally ill individuals chained alongside criminals in cold, unheated cells. She spent the next decade surveying every jail, almshouse, and poorhouse she could reach. Her 1843 memorial to the Massachusetts legislature was direct. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Dix lobbied legislatures across the country. Her work helped to drive the expansion of public mental hospitals in the 19th century. When she began, there were only a small number of state mental hospitals in the United States. By 1880, there were well over 100. We're going to meet Frances Small in this video, and she is someone who spent 15 years at the Maine Insane Asylum before she came to the Bridgton Town Farm. Dix's reforms didn't empty the poorhouses, but some people who once would have lived out their lives chained in a barn got something better instead. There's a line in a local newspaper from 1871 for Naples, Maine, that tells you everything about the social function of the town farm. It reads, "It is thought that the town has saved money by the operation of the town farm, from the fact that needy people will struggle along almost any way rather than go on to the poor farm." Henry David Thoreau understood this. In Walden, which was published in 1854, he wrote about Concord's silent poor, the people who had slipped into poverty so quietly their neighbors barely noticed. His experiment at Walden Pond was partly a proof of the concept that a man could live on almost nothing and stay out of the almshouse. The fear of the poorhouse was not an abstraction in New England. It shaped choices. It constrained lives. It kept people working past the point their bodies could bear. The fear of the poorhouse was real. It was a social force that shaped working class lives for generations. People went hungry rather than go. They worked past the point of their body's ability rather than go. And sometimes they went anyway. In July of 1890, a Maine writer named Sarah Orne Jewett published a short story in the Atlantic Monthly called The Town Poor. It's about two elderly sisters, once respectable, now placed in an unheated attic through the bidding out system. A neighbor who comes to call is horrified by what she finds. When a social worker later challenged Jewett on whether she had exaggerated, Jewett replied, "There is nothing exaggerated about the story." She was writing about the same system, the same Maine, the same world we're talking about today. In August of 1872, the town of Bridgton, Maine, purchased a farm in South Bridgeton, not far from where I grew up, the Asel Foster Farm, one of the original farms in the area. And they bought it to serve as the town's farm and almshouse. A superintendent and matron, usually a married couple, were hired to run the place. And they lived there and they managed the farm, they supervised the inmates, they handled the books, and dealt with the tramps who appeared at odd hours looking for a meal and a bed. They were overseen by the town selectmen and a board of overseers of the poor, often the same people. They set the budget, they approved the expenses, and they filed annual reports to the town, reports that survive in the Bridgton Town records and in the pages of the Bridgton News. The 1880 federal census is a remarkable document. That year, the census included something called the Schedule of Defective, Dependent, and Delinquent Classes, a supplementary form asking questions about disability, illness, and circumstance for residents of institutions. Now, a note on language of the time. Words like idiot, imbecile, and insane in these records are legal and medical classifications from that era. They are not how we talk now, not in the same sense, but they are what the records say, and the records are what we have. The Bridgton Town Farm had 16 people in it in 1880. Let me tell you about some of them. Lydia Littlefield was aged 83 when she was at the town farm. She and her husband Forrest appear in the 1850 Bridgton census, living in different households. She is the head of her household with some of the children, and he is living at a different household with what looks to be probably other boarders, like it is a boarding house. By the time we get to 1870, Forrest is living in the town of Parsonsfield with a different wife, a younger woman who the census says could not read or write. When we get to the 1880 census, Lydia is at the town farm. She's partially paralyzed and has no way to support herself. So for the rest of her life, the town farm was her home. Sally McKinney is at the town farm in 1880. She is 82 years old, and with her is her daughter Harriet, who is 51 and listed as being idiotic. Now, if you follow Sally and her husband Robert and their daughter Harriet through the census records, decade by decade, you can watch a family slowly running out of road. They're living in Naples, and then they're living in Paris, then they're living in Bridgton. Robert McKinney worked as long as he could, and then he couldn't, and then he died. And Sally and Harriet came to the town farm together. They lived out the rest of their lives at the town farm. Mary Cathro was at the town farm. She was 70 years old. This one was a story of economics. Mary's husband Henry had come from England and he worked in the mills. He worked first in the Lowell, Massachusetts mills, then he came to the Saco, Maine mills, and then he came to the Bridgton mills. Mary and Henry were property owners. Henry died in January of 1869, and 2 weeks later, Mary mortgaged their property. 3 years after that, she transferred the property to the mortgage holder entirely, which looks to me like this is a story of a widow who has to mortgage their home and then isn't able to continue paying the mortgage. She died at the town farm on June 25th in 1880, the same year as the census recorded her. She and Henry are both buried at the High Street Cemetery in Bridgton. They were reunited in death. Frances Small, who we mentioned previously, was 55 years old. She was the daughter of Colonel George Small and his wife Dolly Webb Small. At 25, she had a breakdown. The records record it as melancholia. She spent 15 years at the Maine Insane Asylum in Augusta. When she was released in 1879, she came to the Bridgton Town Farm. The census lists her as able-bodied, and we know that she was a seamstress. She was still at the town farm in 1900. I was able to find her in the records when she died. She ended up in the family plot in the Evergreen Cemetery in Portland. So she was one that was reunited with her family after she died. And then there's Seneca Davenport. He was 85 years old. He came from a very large local family. When Seneca was 8 years old, something hit him on the head. The records don't say what. They do say that after that, he was classified as idiotic for the rest of his life. He was also, the census noted, unable to read or write. He ended up at the town farm in old age when getting along was finally no longer possible. Seneca's story is that his family simply died before he did and left him with no one to take care of him. Also on the 1880 census is a woman named Marsylvia Hutchins. Marsylvia appears in the census simply as a resident. She's a widow. She's working there. She is the domestic servant. She did the washing, the cleaning, the nursing of the women who couldn't nurse themselves. She did the invisible work. She wasn't there as a charity case. She was there because someone had to do the work. And Marsylvia Hutchins was the person who did it. Marsylvia was actually a relative of the matron of the town farm. Now, Wesley Kimball was also at the town farm. Wesley was my rabbit hole that led me to all of this. Now, the census listed Wesley as dumb, meaning nonverbal. He'd been at the town farm since roughly the time it opened. But we'll come back to Wesley because he deserves a bigger part in this story. And that brings us back to Edwin Littlefield, who was 13 years old. So Edwin wasn't merely placed at the Bridgton Town Farm. According to the supplementary census schedule, Edwin was born there. His mother was already at the farm, we think, when he came into the world. She did not survive. We don't know the details, but we know that she was deceased. His father is listed as unknown. The record describes his birth as illegitimate and his origins as not respectable and his condition as abandoned, alone from the first moment the paperwork could see him. He was attending school. After 1880, as I mentioned, Edwin disappears from the Bridgton records entirely. He was there in June of 1880 when the census taker came through, and after that, nothing. I looked and I couldn't find him. But I'll come back to Edwin because he's important to me and he deserves his story to be told. So the census gives us names. The Bridgton News gives us voices. The paper covered the town farm regularly. Budget debates, reports from superintendents, the occasional human interest story. And the Bridgton News covered the whole region, which means the stories it printed weren't all about Bridgton, and not all of them were gentle. In 1896, Bridgton's town farm superintendent Samuel Libby sat down with a reporter to talk about tramps, men arriving at all hours, demanding meals and a bed, and apparently a specific reading experience. Libby reported, "My wife and I have been deprived of our sleep night after night by such creatures." He says one man ate 9 biscuits and demanded the Bridgton News specifically. Another asked why there was no carpet on the floor of his room. And Libby's response was, "Since you don't pay any bills, you will take such as you have, otherwise you may get up and get." He noted that tramps had a way of leaving quickly in the morning. His unsawed woodpile, he said, was a skeleton at the feast. In 1912, a correspondent to the newspaper calculated that inmates at the Bridgton Town Farm were being fed at 9.75 cents per person per day. A reader named Cyril Pearl Spur, who turns up in some of my other videos and perhaps a couple of my books, had spent 2 weeks at the town farm cutting hay, and he fired back, "I have been in many places in my life, and the grub at the town farm compares favorably with any of them. It is well cooked, palatable, and wholesome, and there is no limit as to quantity. If Mrs. Redland can furnish that kind of grub for 9.75 cents per person, she has missed her vocation." Cyril Spur had a daughter named Clara. We'll come back to her too. The Bridgton News reported about Christmas in 1888. Said the members of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, made a Merry Christmas call on the people at the poor farm, which carried a gleam of sunshine to the hearts of the inmates who by misfortune had been obliged to find a home there. But not every story from the regional and local town farms was about carpet complaints and grub debates. In December of 1898, a tramp arrived at the Denmark, Maine poor farm. He was well known to the superintendent, Elbridge Thorne. He was a regular. The papers called him a town farm habitué. He worked hard, he caused no trouble, and Mrs. Thorne, in an act of kindness, gave him a pair of mittens. The next morning he came downstairs. He found her alone in the room. He threw the mittens at her with an oath, walked out, and came back with what the Bridgton News described as a 7-pound hardwood billet. The paper reported he suddenly advanced upon the terrified woman, aiming a deadly blow at her head. This she dodged sufficiently to escape its full force, but the billet grazed her head, felled her to the floor, and rendered her unconscious. Her screams were heard by her husband in the barn adjoining, who rushed to the rescue, the assailant darting out another door as he came in. Thorne, it was reported, grabbed a loaded musket and went after him. But the man was gone. 3 months later, Arthur Blabin, his name had been learned by then, turned up at the Poland town farm. The superintendent there recognized him and quietly sent word to the sheriff. Blabin was arrested. He was tried and sentenced to 10 months in the county jail. The paper's verdict: "It is believed that the man is insane." The same week's paper carried another item from Otisfield. A farmer had gone to the Lewiston poor farm and taken in a boy who was 8 or 10 years old. Bought him new clothes, toys, playthings, gave him a home. The paper went on to report the next day after the boy got there, 20 of the farm hens were found killed. They had been murdered in a fiendish way, each head being crushed by the heel of a boot. The next day, all the ducks on the farm were killed the same way. And the next, the last of the poultry turned up its toes in the same mysterious way. And then the paper goes on to report, while passing through a shed, the farmer found a trap, a sharp axe rigged in a position where the baby of the farm was in the habit of playing, with the evident intention that the child should fall onto it and be killed. The next train, it was reported, brought the boy back to Lewiston. And there is this from November of 1881 in the Bridgton News from the Sebago Poor Farm. I'll read it to you exactly as the paper printed it. Tuesday morning, a 5-year-old daughter of a woman on Sebago Poor Farm was found dead under suspicious circumstances. The mother came down to breakfast, leaving the child, as she states, in something good health. When she returned a short time after, to her horror, she found the child dead. There were marks on the child's throat as if it had been strangled, and strong suspicion of foul play by another pauper is entertained. The paper doesn't tell us what happened next, whether anyone was charged, whether the mother was believed, whether the child's name was ever printed. That's all there is. Now, in November of 1942, a newspaper reporter who went by the name of Elderberry, and this brings us back to Clara Berry, daughter of C.P. Spur. Elderberry visited the town farm, and she wrote to the paper about it. After everything we've just read, the violence, the desperation, the stories that end without resolution, I want you to hear this voice. She says, I have just visited our town farm, and I wish it was practical for every taxpayer to do so. The town farm was in very bad shape, equipment and furniture worn out or missing, beds unfit for use, and a mess generally. She asked neighbors to donate furniture, a chair, a table, a lamp, and then she says, none of us knows who may have to go there finally. I have known well-to-do leading citizens to end their days in this place. I personally would like to have things fit for human beings if I had to go there. Don't forget the town farm doesn't belong to South Bridgton. It belongs to the whole town, to Bridgton Center, to North Bridgton, to West Bridgton and the Valley, and Sandy Creek equally. And when Clara Berry wrote about well-to-do leading citizens ending their days at the town farm, she was speaking from memory. The 1900 census tells us who she very likely was thinking of. His name was Horatio Dudley Torrey. Dr. Torrey had practiced medicine in the area for many, many years, and he had been practicing in South Bridgton for nearly a decade, delivering babies, treating illness, serving this community, and so many others during his long life. When his health failed in 1897, the records say his latter years were clouded by disease and misfortune. By 1900, he was at the town farm. His daughter Amoret was 42 years old, and she was there with him. He died in 1904. Clara Berry had watched a respected doctor lose everything and end up at the town farm. She likely knew him. When she sat down 42 years later to write that letter, she was still thinking about the people who deserved better. And Elderberry was also writing the last chapter of the Bridgton Town Farm without knowing it. But let's go back to Wesley Kimball. I told you that he appeared in the 1880 census. He was nonverbal. He was at the town farm since nearly its founding. What the census doesn't tell you is how he got there. And that took some digging. It was one of those rabbit holes that people like me really like. In 1860, in the federal census for the town of Mattawamkeag, which is nowhere near Bridgton, by the way, it's in Penobscot County. There's a widow named Abby Kimball, and she has 5 children. Wesley is 8 years old. Now, Wesley's father, Wesley Kimball Sr., was a carpenter, and he was born in Bridgton, Maine. He had followed his brother Charles to Aroostook County, which is way not near Bridgton. And by 1850, they were in Molunkus. And by 1854, Wesley Sr. was dead, leaving Abby as a widow with 5 children at home, one of them with significant special needs. In 1863, Abby was dead too. Wesley was roughly 11 years old, and he was an orphan. All he had left was a tenuous inherited connection to a town he had probably never set foot in. So somehow, Wesley ended up in Bridgton. By 1870, he was living with the Samuel Day family. I have not been able to find any family relationship with the Day family for Wesley, so it's likely that he was bid out. His care was bid out to the Day family. When Bridgton opened its town farm in 1872, Wesley was among the first residents. One of the things that's fascinating about Wesley Kimball's story is his connection to Bridgton. Wesley is the great-great-grandson of the earliest settler of the town of Bridgton, Maine. That's his connection. And that's an excellent example of someone who comes from an esteemed local family who ends up at the town farm. Now, the Bridgton News mentions Wesley occasionally, which is how I got interested in his situation, what his story was. In April of 1887, there is a report in the paper that says Wesley, one of the incorrigibles whose eccentricities had hitherto baffled former superintendents, has ceased his disagreeable ebullitions, his emotional outbreaks, and now dresses and behaves like a civilized person. Wesley Kimball made the Bridgton News by learning to dress himself. And then in June of 1898, Wesley disappeared, and the Bridgton News reported Wesley Kimball, now and for many years a town charge, a man of unsound mind, disappeared Thursday of last week from the poor farm. The weather being wet and cold, it was feared he would suffer, if not perish. And so parties of South Bridgton citizens made active daily search for him until Sunday, when they found him near the shore of Peabody Pond, and evidently none the worse for his adventure. He was taken back to the farm. 3 days, cold weather, wet, a nonverbal man who had been institutionalized for over 20 years, somewhere near the shore of Peabody Pond. What was he doing there? What did he want? The British News had no interest in asking those questions. He was found, he was taken back. That was the story. Another fascinating thing about Wesley Kimball is the story of how he became to be, in the words of the time, idiotic. And here is the story. His mother was frightened by a bull when she was pregnant. There you go. Wesley Kimball died on February 7th in 1918, and he was reported to be at that time 75 years old. He had been a resident at the town farm for 50 years or more, and his parents are listed on the death record as unknown. But we know them. Wesley Sr. and Abby. We know their names. He arrived as an orphan with a family connection, and he died as a ward of the town. And in between, he had a life, strange, constrained, and a long time spent in the care of the town. Wesley is the reason I started looking into town farms. But there's someone else who jumped out of that 1880 census to me, and that was a boy named Edwin Littlefield. The 1880 census, he is 13 years old. I looked at the people that he shared that house with, those people that he saw on a day-to-day basis, the people he was growing up with, the elderly, the disabled, the ill, the people who had been released from mental hospitals, all of the challenges that those people were dealing with. And that's the environment that young Edwin was growing up in. And I thought to myself, my goodness, this boy must have quite a story to tell. So what we know about Edwin Littlefield is that he was born at the Bridgton Town Farm, and according to the supplementary census schedule, his mother was there when he arrived. She didn't survive. We don't know the details of that. He had no father on record. He did not have respectable origins. There was no one who seemed to have a claim on him. He was 13 years old. He was going to school, and he had never lived anywhere else as far as we can tell. Now, after June of 1880, I searched and searched and searched for him, and I could not find what happened to him after that point. He's just gone from the records. It's possible he became an apprentice. That would have been a normal thing and went to a different town. It's possible he could have been adopted, but I don't see any record of that. The next census would have been the 1890 census, which genealogists among us would know is not a census we have access to because it was burnt up. The dreaded 1890 census, missing information. And it's possible that he died. He just isn't there anymore. I cannot find him. So after I searched and searched for him, I realized that he very conveniently had provided the perfect story for me. We don't know what his story is, and so that allowed me to create his story for him. That's what led me to write The Town Farm Boy. That is Edwin's story as I have imagined it, because I wanted him to leave the town farm and have a life. I wanted that for him. And history does bear out that some children were able to get out of that system. In the fall of 1876, a 10-year-old Irish girl named Annie Sullivan was placed at the Massachusetts State Almshouse in Tewksbury. Her mother had died of tuberculosis, and her father had abandoned her and her younger brother, Jimmy. Annie had trachoma, a bacterial infection that was slowly destroying her vision. She had never been to school. Jimmy died within 4 months of their arrival at the almshouse, leaving Annie alone. And the almshouse held more than 800 inmates, tramps, the mentally ill, the elderly, poor, pregnant women with nowhere to go, foundlings, children left on the doorstep. Annie Sullivan slept on an iron cot in a dormitory where rats ran between the beds. She later said, "I doubt if life, or eternity for that matter, is long enough to erase the errors and ugly blots scored upon my brain by those dismal years." She called her years at Tewksbury a crime against childhood. 4 years passed. In the fall of 1880, the same year the census taker came through Bridgton, a Massachusetts charity inspector named Franklin Sanborn visited the Tewksbury almshouse. Annie Sullivan followed the delegation through the wards until she was close enough to speak. "Mr. Sanborn, I want to go to school." Mr. Sanborn listened. He arranged her transfer to the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. 6 years later, she graduated as class valedictorian. Within a decade, she was Helen Keller's teacher, and her name was known around the world. When I told Edwin's story in Town Farm Boy, I set the novel in Pondicherry, Maine, which is my fictionalized version of Bridgton, and I set it in 1880 and the years beyond. Edwin is there, 13 years old, born at the town farm, a ward of the town. The superintendent at the time is Amos Sanborn. Mr. Sanborn's daughter, Addie, in real life became his daughter, Nan, in the story. And she is Edwin's closest friend, his chosen family when blood family isn't an option. Wesley's there too, based directly on the real Wesley Kimball. He's nonverbal, given to wandering, found eventually at the shore of the pond and brought back. Mary Lou in the story, who is drawn from the real-life Marsylvia Hutchins, is the woman who does the invisible work. And I added in a powerful man in Bridgton, a lawyer and a senator, with a secret connection to Edwin that goes all the way back to Edwin's mother. A secret he will spend the entire novel trying to bury. When I started thinking about Edwin in terms of this book, I wanted him to have his own distinct voice. And this is what Edwin had to say about his own situation. "Something you should know about me right off. My ma is dead. Some say it's on account of me. I hope that ain't true because killing your ma is a pretty bad thing to do, especially on account of I was just being born and all. Pastor Fry tells me it wa'n't my fault on account of the wages of sin being death. All I know is I ain't got a ma, nor a pa neither. I don't reckon I killed him. I reckon he just up and disappeared because I killed my ma. Seems a feller wouldn't take kindly to a baby for doing what I did. I don't know. I guess folks don't know much what to do with a boy that hasn't got a ma or a pa. Pastor said some old soldier feller put some cash money aside for the worthy and industrious poor way back in the olden days. The old feller fought at Bunker Hill, and I sure would like to hear him tell some stories about them days. Anyway, I'm not worthy on account of killing my ma, so I guess my lot is to be industrious. Mr. Sanborn says that means I have to work extra hard doing chores and the like around the farm so as I earn my keep and I'm not a burden on the town. Edwin Littlefield, in his own words, or the closest thing to his own words that I could give him. I'll put a link to the book in the description in case you want to read it. Now, what happened to the town farms? We can see in Bridgton an example of what happened. Elderberry's letter ran in November of 1942, where she was calling for donations of furniture to fix the place up a bit. By May of 1943, she was writing again. The renovation work had been started and stopped halfway. There were new floors, there were painted rooms, fireplace opened up, but the town manager had announced that the farm would close. The three remaining inmates would be placed elsewhere. The Bridgton Town Farm closed in 1943, 71 years after the town purchased the Asel Foster Farm in South Bridgeton. The closing wasn't an isolated event. The Great Depression had broken the old model. When a third of the country was poor, the idea that poverty was a local problem with a local solution became obviously untenable. The New Deal created Social Security, unemployment insurance, the infrastructure that would become the Medicare and Medicaid systems. Nursing homes and state hospitals replaced poorhouses one by one. The farmhouse in South Bridgeton is still standing. It's privately owned, so please respect that. But the house where Wesley Kimball and Edwin Littlefield and Lydia Littlefield and Mary Cathro and Marsilvia Hutchins and Dr. Horatio Torrey lived is still there. Some of these places became something else entirely. The Auburn City Farm in Auburn, Maine, once the city of Auburn's answer to poverty and desperation, is now Central Maine Community College, a place that was the last resort is now a place that launches dreams. I made a video about the Auburn City Farm a while back, and I'll link that in the description. Here's something you might want to think about when you're driving through a New England town. Look at the road signs. Almost every town in New England, large or small, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, has a road called Town Farm Road. Sometimes it's Poor Farm Road. Sometimes it's Almshouse Lane. That road goes somewhere, or it used to. And now you know what it was. The Bridgton Town Farm closed in 1943. The Social Security Act had passed in 1935. Medicare and Medicaid came in 1965. The VA system expanded. We had decided as a society that the town farm model was inadequate, that individuals shouldn't have to rely on the random charity of their town, that needs were national responsibilities. And so the poorhouses closed one by one across New England and across the country. But the people who ended up at the Bridgton Town Farm in 1880, elderly, disabled, mentally ill, orphaned, without family, without resources, those people didn't stop existing. The categories are the same. The circumstances are different. The safety nets are real. And yet, on a single night in January 2024, federal counts found 32,882 American veterans experiencing homelessness, some in shelters, some outside, some in places never meant for human habitation. Many served in wars they didn't choose. They came home changed in ways that couldn't be fixed. And they fell through the gaps in a system that was supposed to catch them. The paperwork was wrong. The wait was too long. The discharge status didn't qualify. They did their part, but the net had a hole. And a growing number of older Americans are living on the edge of homelessness, some in cars, some in motels, some doubled up with family, some one missed payment away from losing the place they still call home. Not because they chose it, because a medical bill arrived or a spouse died or the rent went up faster than the check did. We call some of it vehicular homelessness now. In 1880, the road often ended at the town farm. People with serious mental illness remain among those most vulnerable to homelessness in America today. In 1880, people described in the records as insane, idiotic, disabled, or dependent were common residents of town farms and almshouses. The institution changed, but the vulnerability did not. Martin Brown, who lived at the town farm in 1880 was blind and alone. He was working past his body's ability. He died of what was then called Bright's disease, which was very likely type 1 diabetes. Francis Small had a breakdown at 25 and never fully came back. Dr. Horatio Torrey practiced medicine for decades and then ran out of road. Sally McKenney and her daughter Harriet stayed together because they had nowhere else to go. These were not failures of character. They were failures of circumstance. That distinction was debated in 1880 and it is debated now. And I am not going to tell you what the answer is. That is not what this video is for. What I will tell you is what Elderberry wrote in 1942. None of us knows who may have to go there finally. She was right then. She is still right. The town farm is closed, and the question it was trying to answer, imperfectly, inadequately, sometimes cruelly, is not. The 1880 census, 16 names. Amos and Dorcas Sanborn running the farm, their daughter Addie, Lydia Littlefield, whose husband left her, Sally McKenney and her daughter Harriet, Mary Cathro, who lost everything in 2 weeks and died, Frances Small, the colonel's daughter who kept sewing, Seneca Davenport, who had been getting along somehow for 85 years, Marsylvia Hutchins, who did the work that nobody counted, Wesley Kimball, who had made the paper by learning to dress himself, and who disappeared to a pond once and came back, and eventually died at the farm, and Edwin Littlefield, born at the town farm, his mother deceased, his father unknown. I don't know what happened to Edwin. I hope it was something good. In my novel, spoiler alert, I give him a happy ending. I'll see you again somewhere in time.